The dog should have been dead by midnight, but the name beneath the ice had waited 8 years to be read. Snow moved sideways across Bozeman, Montana, whitening the empty street and swallowing the amber glow of the lamps outside Haven Ridge Veterans Shelter. The temperature had fallen to 9 degrees, and the wind made it feel colder, sharp enough to turn every breath into pain. Inside, the old building settled around 30 sleeping veterans. Pipes clicked behind the walls. A coffee maker gave off the burnt, familiar smell of a long night shift. Near the front desk, Staff Sergeant Ethan Walker sat beneath a faded American flag, repairing the loose buckle on a donated winter coat. At 39, Ethan still carried the shape of the Marine he had once been. Tall, broad through the shoulders, dark brown hair cut close, with gray beginning to show above his ears. A narrow scar rested beside his left temple, pale against weathered skin. Most people at Haven Ridge knew him as the man who remembered how everyone took their coffee. The man who could calm a nightmare without asking what caused it. The man who never spoke about his own. At 1:17 a.m., something touched the front door. Not a knock, more like a soft scrape. Ethan looked up. The sound came again, weak and uneven, nearly lost beneath the wind. He set the coat aside and crossed the lobby. Through the frosted glass, he saw nothing but snow turning beneath the porch light. Then a shadow moved near the bottom of the door. Ethan opened it, and winter rushed inside. Cold air swept across the tile, carrying the scent of pine, wet pavement, and something faintly animal. At the edge of the porch lay a German shepherd. The dog was large, though hunger and age had narrowed his frame. Snow covered his back like a burial cloth. His sable coat had frozen into dark ridges, and silver fur circled his muzzle. One ear stood upright. The other leaned slightly at the tip, marked by a small missing notch. His paws were tucked beneath him, but they no longer seemed able to hold his weight. For one terrible second, Ethan saw no movement. Then the dog's ribs lifted. Barely. One breath. A pause. Another. Easy, Ethan whispered. His voice changed without permission, dropping into the low, steady tone he had not used in years. I've got you. The shepherd's amber eyes opened halfway. They did not focus on Ethan. They looked past him, through him, as though searching the warm hallway for someone who might no longer exist. Ethan stepped into the storm without reaching too quickly. Old working dogs remembered fear in the hands of strangers. He knew that much. He also knew the stillness of a K-9 conserving the last of his strength. Snow collected on Ethan's hair and shoulders as he crouched beside the animal. Around the dog's chest was a military-style harness, faded olive drab beneath a thick shell of ice. The nylon straps were worn smooth. One metal ring had darkened with age. This was not something bought from a pet store. It had been made for duty. Ethan placed 2 fingers against the dog's neck. A pulse fluttered there, thin but stubborn. Stay with me, buddy. The shepherd's ear shifted at the word buddy, but his head fell back against the boards. Ethan slid one arm beneath his chest and the other under his hindquarters. The dog was lighter than he should have been. Still, when Ethan lifted him, the weight pressed against an old place inside his chest, a room he had kept locked for nearly a decade. The shepherd gave no protest. His frozen head settled against Ethan's shoulder. For 3 steps, the dog's nose rested near the collar of Ethan's flannel shirt, breathing in soap, coffee, wool, and the faint cedar scent of the shelter. Then his body trembled once. Not from the cold. From recognition too weak to become memory. Ethan carried him inside and kicked the door closed behind them. Warm air gathered around the dog, releasing the smell of wet fur and old canvas. A veteran named Walter stirred in a chair near the fireplace and raised his head. That a wolf? He asked softly. German shepherd, Ethan said. Call Claire. Within minutes, blankets covered the lobby floor. Ethan lowered the dog near the radiator while Walter phoned Dr. Claire Bennett, the veterinarian who volunteered at Haven Ridge whenever an animal arrived with a veteran who could not afford care. Ethan filled a stainless steel bowl with lukewarm water, but the shepherd did not drink. He only watched the door. Snow melted from his coat and formed a dark circle on the blanket. Ethan began loosening the harness, careful not to pull at the frozen straps. His fingers stopped when he felt a raised seam beneath the ice. Red thread, a repair stitched by hand. The room seemed to narrow. Years ago, under a canvas awning half a world away, Ethan had used red medical thread to mend a torn K-9 K-9 harness because it was the only color available. His stitches had been uneven. The last one crossed the corner twice. He stared at the same crooked cross now. No, he breathed. Meltwater slid over the harness and cleared a rectangular patch above the dog's shoulder. White letters slowly appeared against black fabric. W-A-L-K-E-R. Ethan stepped back as though the name had spoken aloud. Walter watched him from across the room, but asked nothing. Ethan's hands began to shake. 8 winters vanished. The shelter walls became canvas, dust, heat, and a promise made to a younger animal with bright eyes and an unscarred muzzle. Nobody leaves alone. Ethan sank to his knees beside the shepherd. He was afraid to touch him now. Afraid hope could be another kind of wound. The dog's eyes remained closed. Ethan leaned closer, his voice breaking around a name he had not allowed himself to say in years. Ronan. The shepherd released a low, trembling sound. Not a bark, not quite a whine. Just one broken note rising from somewhere beneath the cold. Then, without opening his eyes, he turned his muzzle toward Ethan's hand. The sound was so small that Walter almost missed it, but Ethan did not. He had heard that note before in desert heat, beneath the roar of engines and the hiss of radio static, whenever Ronan was too tired to stand but refused to stop watching him. Ethan held his hand still beside the dog's muzzle. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the shepherd drew in a shallow breath and pressed his nose against Ethan's knuckles. The touch lasted less than a second. It was not enough to prove anything. It was enough to make Ethan forget how to breathe. Outside, the storm leaned against the shelter. Windows, rattling the glass in its frames. Inside, Haven Ridge remained dim and warm, carrying the familiar smells of old wood, laundry soap, coffee, and the cedar logs Walter had placed near the fireplace earlier that evening. A hallway light clicked on. Samuel Ortiz, a Vietnam veteran who slept in the room nearest the lobby, stepped out wearing a red plaid robe and wool socks. He took one look at Ethan kneeling beside the dog and lowered his voice. "What do you need?" Ethan did not look up. "More towels and the first aid cabinet from the office." Samuel nodded and moved without asking why. That was how Haven Ridge worked. Men arrived carrying histories they did not know how to explain, and everyone learned to help before demanding a reason. Ethan had taught them that. He was the one who stayed awake with Samuel when thunder pulled him back 50 years. He was the one who drove Walter to a dental appointment after Walter admitted he had not sat in a medical waiting room since leaving the service. He repaired broken heaters, filled out benefit forms, found clean boots in the right sizes, and kept extra peanut butter in the pantry because one resident ate it when anxiety made everything else taste like dust. Ethan could recognize pain in another person before it showed on their face. He simply refused to name his own. Samuel returned with the towels. Together, they packed them gently around the shepherd's body, leaving his face uncovered. Ethan checked the dog's breathing again. Slow, uneven, still there. He kept one hand against the thick fur near the animal's shoulder, as though the warmth of his palm might persuade the old heart beneath it to remain. The letters on the harness stayed visible between his fingers. Walker. His own name looked foreign there. "Is he yours?" Samuel asked. Ethan's eyes remained on the dog. "I do not know." It was the first lie he had told inside Haven Ridge. The truth was more difficult. Ethan knew the harness. He knew the red thread. He knew the notch in the left ear and the small pale mark above the right eye. Yet the dog lying before him looked older than the Ronan preserved in memory. This animal carried silver around his muzzle, stiffness in his limbs, and a distance behind his closed eyes that 8 missing years could have built. Hope wanted Ethan to claim him. Guilt warned him not to. Headlights swept across the frosted windows 20 minutes later. Dr. Claire Bennett entered through the front door with snow on her green parka and a hard-sided medical case in one hand. She was 42, composed and direct, with light brown hair pulled beneath a knit cap and the kind of steady expression that made frightened animals tolerate her presence. She removed her gloves as she crossed the lobby. "How long has he been inside?" "About 25 minutes, Ethan said. "He was unconscious when I found him." He moved once. Claire knelt beside the shepherd and began her examination. She listened to his chest, checked his gums, felt along his legs, and measured his temperature twice. Her face revealed almost nothing, but Ethan noticed the slight tightening around her eyes. "He is severely chilled," she said. He is dehydrated, underweight, and exhausted. We warm him slowly. No heating pad directly against the skin. No hot water. His body has already been through enough tonight. Ethan nodded before she finished speaking. He knew the principles. He had treated cold-stressed working dogs in mountain training exercises years earlier. His hands remembered procedures his mind had tried to bury. Claire inserted a line for warm fluids, while Samuel dimmed the lobby lights. Walter placed a fresh pot of coffee on the counter and then sat quietly across the room, pretending not to watch. The shelter became a kind of chapel without anyone deciding it should. Pipes murmured. Wind moved along the roof. The old dog's breathing filled the spaces between. Claire clipped a small patch of damp fur near the shepherd's shoulder and passed a scanner over his body. The device remained silent. She tried the neck, chest, and both sides. Nothing. No microchip? Ethan asked. Not one that is responding. Try again. Claire looked at him, then did. The scanner gave no tone. Ethan sat back on his heels. He wanted to ask whether chips failed after years in the cold, whether military records could be recovered, whether a name on a harness and a crooked line of red thread could be enough to return the dead to the living. Instead, he reached for a towel and wiped melting snow from the dog's ear. Ronan hated the cold, he said before he could stop himself. Claire paused. You knew a dog named Ronan? Ethan's jaw tightened. A long time ago. The shepherd's eyes opened. Amber, clouded slightly with age, they moved first toward Claire, then toward Samuel, then across the unfamiliar room. Finally, they settled on Ethan. He leaned closer, afraid even the movement might break the moment. Hey, partner, he whispered. The dog stared at him. No lift of the ears. No movement of the tail. No recognition entered those tired eyes. Ethan offered his hand, palm down, exactly as he had thousands of times before. The shepherd smelled his fingers, then slowly turned his head away. The motion was gentle. It still felt like a door closing. Ethan lowered his hand. Claire continued examining the harness, tracing the stitching and worn buckles. Near the inner chest strap, she found a narrow scar hidden beneath the dog's fur. It was straight, clean, and old. She parted the coat and studied it beneath the examination light. Ethan, she said quietly, there used to be a microchip here. He looked at her. Claire's fingertips rested beside the scar. It did not fail, she said. Someone removed it. Someone had not merely lost Ronan. Someone had tried to erase him. Ethan stared at the narrow scar beneath the shepherd's fur while the storm pressed against Haven Ridge like a living thing. Claire said something about old surgical work and possible records, but her voice faded beneath another sound rising inside him. The low mechanical hum of a transport vehicle crossing a desert road 8 years earlier. Memory did not return gently. It came with heat, with dust, with the dry scent of canvas, fuel, and sun-baked earth. Afghanistan had been a world of pale mountains and endless sky, where every shadow seemed sharper and every silence carried weight. Ethan had been 31 then, still young enough to believe discipline could protect a man from grief. Ronan was 3, lean and restless, with a black saddle across his back and amber eyes that missed nothing. They moved together through every day as though joined by an invisible line. Ethan watched the horizon. Ronan watched Ethan. A lifted ear meant caution. A lowered head meant weight. One glance could carry an entire command. The other Marines joked that Ronan understood English better than most new recruits, but Ethan knew it was not language. It was trust practiced until it became instinct. On a cold morning near a small farming village, their patrol stopped beside a narrow road bordered by stone walls and wind-bent grass. Nothing looked wrong. That was what Ethan remembered most. The sky was clear. A child's red kite moved above a distant rooftop. Somewhere behind the wall, a goat bell rang softly. Ronan took 3 steps forward, then froze. His tail lowered. His nose lifted once toward the road. Ethan saw the change immediately. Hold, he said. Every Marine behind him stopped. Ronan sat without looking back, his body rigid, attention fixed on a patch of ground no different from any other. Ethan trusted him. No debate. No second guess. The patrol changed course and waited while specialists examined the area. Later, they confirmed that Ronan's warning had prevented the team from crossing a hidden danger. No one celebrated loudly. They simply gathered beneath a canvas awning as evening cooled the air, each man understanding how close an ordinary morning had come to becoming something else. Ronan lay beside Ethan with his head resting on one boot, accepting quiet praise as though he had only completed a simple chore. Ethan noticed a seam on the dog's harness had torn during the patrol. The repair kit was missing, so he borrowed red medical thread from a corpsman named Mason Reed. "That is going to look terrible," Mason said, handing him the needle. "It only has to hold," Ethan replied. He sat on an overturned supply crate while Ronan watched every pass of the thread. Ethan's stitches were uneven. At the corner, he crossed the last one twice to keep it from slipping. When he finished, he rubbed the fur between Ronan's ears. "Nobody leaves alone," he said. Ronan gave a soft breath and leaned against his knee. The promise felt simple then, almost easy. 3 weeks later, a sandstorm moved across the valley before dawn, turning the world the color of rust. Ethan and Ronan were returning from a routine search with Mason and 4 other Marines when the ground shuddered somewhere beyond the road. There was no clear picture in Ethan's memory after that. Only dust folding over the sky, voices becoming distant, Ronan's harness slipping through his fingers. Ethan remembered calling the dog's name once, then again, but the wind swallowed both. When his vision cleared, he was lying inside a medical transport with bright lights above him and the steady vibration of an engine beneath the floor. Mason was beside him, one hand braced against the wall. Ethan tried to sit up. "Ronan," he said. Mason looked toward the rear doors. His face carried the answer before he spoke. "They are still searching." Ethan reached for the latch, but strength had left his arms. "Turn around." "We cannot. He is out there." Mason leaned closer. "I know." Through the small rear window, Ethan saw nothing but dust and fading lights. Then, beneath the engine noise, he heard one distant bark, one sharp note from somewhere behind them. He carried that sound through every hospital room that followed, through official reports that listed Ronan as missing, through months of calls, letters, and unanswered questions, through the day someone finally told him to accept that no working dog could survive alone for long in that country. Ethan never accepted it. He only stopped speaking about it. Now, in the quiet lobby of Haven Ridge, the same dog lay beneath his hand, older and nearly frozen, with the red thread still crossing the harness corner twice. Ethan looked into Ronan's tired face and understood that the promise had not disappeared. It had simply taken 8 years to find its way home. Morning had not yet reached Bozeman when Ethan returned fully to the room. The fire had burned low, the windows had turned pale with frost, and Ronan lay beneath 3 blankets while warm fluids moved slowly through the line Claire had secured. Ethan stayed on the floor beside him, one hand resting near the old harness, and the other closed around the edge of the blanket. He had spent 8 years imagining this moment. In every version, Ronan knew him at once. There was a lifted head, a rush forward, a sound of joy too large for the room. Reality was quieter. Ronan opened his eyes, looked at Ethan, and saw only a stranger. Claire checked the dog's temperature again. It had risen slightly, but not enough. "His body is responding," she said. "That is good." Ethan kept watching Ronan. "What about his memory?" Claire followed his gaze. "Age can change recognition. Trauma can change it. Illness can change it. Sometimes scent returns before sight. Sometimes voice. Sometimes nothing happens until the animal feels safe." Ethan nodded as though he understood, but safety had never been difficult between them. Ronan had once slept through sandstorms with his spine pressed against Ethan's boot. He had once refused food until Ethan returned from a medical tent. He had once crossed a crowded landing zone, ignoring shouting men and moving vehicles, because Ethan had called his name. Now the sound meant nothing. Ethan reached into the pocket of his coat and removed a small brass clicker attached to an old key ring. He carried it without admitting why. It had been Ronan's training marker, worn smooth by years beneath his thumb. The sound was soft when he pressed it. One clean click. Ronan's ear moved, but his eyes remained on the opposite wall. Ethan clicked again, then spoke the command that had once brought the dog directly to his left side. "Ronan, heel." The shepherd did not move. "Ronan, look." No response. Walter stood near the kitchen entrance with 2 mugs of coffee, then quietly set one on the floor beside Ethan and walked away. No one in the shelter offered comfort. They knew some grief could not bear witnesses. Ethan waited several minutes before trying again, sure whether he spoke to Ronan or to the room. Claire sat back against the radiator. You do not have to prove anything tonight. The harness proves it. The harness proves that the name is connected to you. The scar above his eye, the ear, the stitching, those things matter. But Claire was silent for a moment. But wanting him to be Ronan does not make his mind return on command. Ethan looked down at the dog. The truth was gentle. It still hurt. He rose slowly, his knees stiff from the floor, and walked to the window. Snow continued to sweep across the street, filling the footprints between the porch and the curb. Somewhere beyond the white darkness, church bells marked 4 o'clock. The sound traveled softly through the storm. Ronan lifted his head a fraction, then let it fall again. Ethan pressed his palm to the cold glass. He remembered another dawn, another wind, another sound being carried away before it could reach him. Maybe he had another handler, Ethan said. Maybe someone else became home. Claire did not answer. Maybe I am only the name on what he was wearing. Behind him, the blankets shifted. Ethan turned. Ronan was trying to move, but not toward him. The dog's front paws pushed against the floor while his hind legs remained weak beneath him. Claire leaned forward. Easy boy. Ronan sank back down. Ethan felt the old command rise to his tongue, but he swallowed it. He would not turn this into a test the dog could fail. He picked up his coat from the chair and moved toward the hallway. Where are you going? Claire asked. I need air. It is 9 degrees outside. Then I will stand by the door. He reached the threshold and stopped beneath the framed photographs of veterans who had passed through Haven Ridge. His hand rested on the knob. Without thinking, he exhaled 3 low notes. A whistle. Short, short, long. The private recall signal he had used when radios could not be trusted. The lobby went still. Behind him, claws scraped against tile. Ethan did not turn at first. He was afraid the sound belonged to memory. Then Claire whispered his name. Ronan had pushed himself upright. His leg from his back. He took 1 step. Stopped. Took another. Ethan turned just as the old shepherd crossed the final few feet and collapsed against his boots. Ethan dropped to his knees and caught him before his head struck the floor. Ronan's body shook with effort, but he did not pull away. Slowly, the dog raised his muzzle. His eyes found Ethan's face and stayed there. Something changed within them. Not certainty. Not yet. But recognition had opened the smallest door. Ethan caught Ronan against his chest and felt the old dog's heart beating fast beneath the damp fur. For several seconds, neither of them moved. The lobby seemed to hold its breath with them. The storm still whispered along the windows. The radiator still clicked, and somewhere in the kitchen the coffee maker gave a tired hiss. But all of it had become distant. Ronan's amber eyes remained fixed on Ethan's face. The cloudiness of age was still there. So was the exhaustion. Yet beneath both, something had shifted. Ethan lifted one hand slowly and placed it beneath Ronan's jaw, using the same gentle hold he had used during field examinations years before. Ronan leaned into his palm. Not much. Just enough. Ethan's throat tightened. There you are, he whispered. Ronan breathed out through his nose and closed his eyes. Claire moved beside them with the blankets, careful not to break the fragile peace. She helped Ethan lower the dog back onto the padded floor, but Ronan kept one paw resting across Ethan's boot. When Ethan tried to move it gently, the paw pressed down. Walter turned away toward the fireplace, giving them privacy without leaving. Samuel stood near the hallway with his hands folded, his expression softened by a memory he did not share. Claire examined Ronan again, this time with Ethan holding him. The dog remained calm beneath Ethan's touch. She checked the old scar above his right eye, measured the notch in his left ear, and felt along the front leg where the fur grew slightly uneven. You said he had an injury here? She asked. Ethan nodded. Training accident at Camp Lejeune. He landed badly during an obstacle course. Nothing serious, but it left a crescent-shaped scar beneath the right foreleg. Claire parted the thick coat. Beneath it was a pale curve, small and clean, hidden close to the chest. Ethan stared at it. He remembered kneeling beside a younger Ronan in a bright clinic room while the dog tried to steal gauze from a tray. He remembered laughing when Ronan finally succeeded. The memory hurt, but for the first time, it did not feel empty. Claire looked at Ethan. This is strong evidence. Strong is not the same as certain. No, she said, but I can make it certain. She opened her medical case and removed her tablet. Haven Ridge had access to a secure veterans network through its partnership with the county hospital. Claire contacted an emergency records specialist, then requested archived military veterinary files using the identification number stamped inside the harness buckle. Minutes passed slowly. Ethan stayed beside Ronan, tracing the fur between his ears. Ronan watched him as though assembling the pieces of an old language. At 5:23 in the morning, Claire's tablet chimed. She opened the file. A younger German shepherd appeared on the screen, standing alert beside a training fence. Dark saddle, amber eyes, notched left ear. A dental chart followed, along with measurements, medical history, and a photograph of the same crescent scar beneath the foreleg. Claire compared each detail. Then she turned the screen toward Ethan. It is him. The words were simple. They broke something open. Ethan bowed his head until his forehead rested against Ronan's. No speech came. No grand apology. Only breath. Warm against warm. Ronan lifted his muzzle and touched Ethan's cheek once with his nose. Ethan closed his eyes. 8 years of guilt moved through him in silence. The hospital rooms. The letters. The calls that ended with polite voices and no answers. The nights when he imagined Ronan waiting beside a road that no longer existed. I came back for you, Ethan said at last. Ronan's tail moved across the blanket. Once. Then again. Walter made a soft sound near the fireplace, half laugh and half sob. Samuel lowered his head. Claire looked down at her tablet, allowing the moment to belong only to the Marine and the dog. Ethan slid, one arm around Ronan's shoulders. The old shepherd rested against him without hesitation now. His body was thin, his strength nearly gone, but the bond between them had not vanished. It had waited beneath age, fear, and distance like an ember under snow. Ethan reached for the harness and set it beside them. Ronan's eyes followed it immediately. His ears lifted. Then his breathing changed. He pushed against Ethan's arm and tried to stand. Easy, Ethan said. You are home. Ronan ignored the words. He reached for the harness with his teeth, caught one worn strap, and pulled it toward the front door. Claire stepped closer. He should not be moving. Ethan took the harness from Ronan, but the dog whined and stretched his neck toward the entrance. The sound was urgent now, not confused, not afraid. Ronan scraped one paw against the tile and looked from the door to Ethan. Then he did it again. Ethan followed his gaze. Snow had covered every track outside, and the street beyond the porch was still empty. Yet Ronan would not look away. He had crossed the storm for a reason. Finding Ethan had only been part of it. Ethan watched Ronan pull toward the entrance until the meaning became impossible to ignore. The dog had not crossed miles of frozen streets simply to collapse at the first warm doorway he found. He had come looking for help. There is someone out there, Ethan said. Claire looked toward the windows, where snow moved in pale sheets beneath the streetlights. He can barely stand. Then he does not walk. Ethan crossed the lobby and opened the storage closet beside the office. Inside were donated blankets, folding chairs, 2 snow shovels, and a low utility wagon used to move boxes from the pantry. He spread a thick quilt across the wagon and carried Ronan onto it. The shepherd resisted at first, his paws searching for the floor, but Ethan placed the old harness beside his head and rested one hand against his shoulder. You lead, he said softly. I will do the walking. Claire wrapped Ronan in another blanket, leaving only his head exposed. 20 minutes, she said. Then you bring him back, whether you find anything or not. Ethan pulled on his coat, gloves, and will cap. Samuel handed him a flashlight. Walter opened the front door, and the storm entered like a cold breath from another world. Dawn was still more than an hour away. Snow covered the sidewalk in drifts nearly a foot deep, smoothing the street into a quiet white river. Ethan stepped outside and pulled the wagon behind him. Ronan lifted his head immediately. His nose tested the wind. At the edge of the porch, he turned toward the west. Ethan followed. Their progress was slow. The wagon wheels caught in the snow, and Ethan had to lift the front end over each drift. Ronan remained alert despite his weakness. Every few yards, he raised his muzzle, listened, then looked back at Ethan before choosing a direction. They passed a closed diner, a dark hardware store, and a small church where snow had gathered on the wooden steps. No cars moved. No voices carried through the storm. Only the scrape of Ethan's boots and the soft rattle of the wagon followed them down the block. After 400 yards, Ronan gave a low whine and turned toward an alley between the church and an abandoned laundromat. Ethan aimed the flashlight into the darkness. Tire tracks had nearly disappeared beneath fresh snow. They led behind the building to an empty gravel lot bordered by cottonwood trees. A white cargo van sat near the far fence, half buried along one side. Frost covered the windshield. No lights were on. Ronan struggled upright inside the wagon. "Easy," Ethan said, but the shepherd pawed toward the van. Ethan moved faster. As he approached, he saw a length of blue fabric trapped in the passenger door and a small metal bowl lying upside down beneath the rear bumper. He knocked on the driver's window. No answer. He tried the handle. Locked. Ronan began to whine again, louder now, his eyes fixed on the side door. Ethan moved around the van and found it unlatched. The door resisted, sealed by ice, then opened with a low crack. Air colder than the street drifted from inside. The van had been turned into a narrow living space. A mattress lay along one wall beneath folded blankets. Plastic bins held canned food, dog supplies, and neatly arranged medicine bottles. Maps covered the other wall, each marked with circles, dates, and handwritten notes. Near the front seat, a man lay beneath a gray coat, motionless but breathing. He appeared to be in his mid-40s, with a graying beard and dark hair grown long around his ears. One hand rested beside an empty bottle of heart medication. The other held a worn leather leash. Ethan climbed inside and checked his pulse. Slow but present. "Sir, can you hear me?" The man did not respond. Ethan took out his phone and called emergency services. While he gave the location, Ronan pushed himself from the wagon and tried to climb into the van. Ethan lifted him carefully and placed him beside the man. The change was immediate. Ronan pressed his nose beneath the man's hand and released a soft, broken sound. The fingers moved. Barely. Then they closed around the fur near Ronan's neck. "You found him," the man whispered without opening his eyes. Ethan froze. The voice was older, roughened by years and cold, but memory recognized it before reason could. He looked at the man's face again, past the beard, the deep lines, and the exhaustion. "Mason." The man's eyes opened slowly. Confusion passed through them, then disbelief. "Walker," he breathed. The name carried 8 years of distance. Sirens sounded faintly beyond the snow. Ethan sat back on his heels, unable to speak. Beside Mason's mattress lay a thick notebook secured with an elastic band. The cover was worn soft from use. Ethan picked it up and opened to the first page. His own name was written across the top, followed by hospital addresses, veterans' offices, old unit contacts, and dates stretching across nearly a decade. Some entries had been crossed out. Others ended with the same words. "No record found. No forwarding address. Keep searching." A photograph slipped from between the pages. It showed Mason kneeling beside Ronan outside a small roadside motel. The dog was thinner than Ethan remembered, but alive. On the back, Mason had written a single sentence. "He still waits by every door." Ethan turned to the final page. The ink there was recent, pressed deep into the paper by an unsteady hand. "Ronan still remembers him. I just pray I find Walker before Ronan runs out of winters." Ethan looked at the old dog resting between them. Ronan had not chosen one man over the other. He had carried them both through the years, and tonight, when Mason could no longer ask for help, Ronan had gone into the storm to find the only person whose name he had never forgotten. The paramedics reached the van within minutes, their red lights turning the snow around them into a slow pulse of color. Mason was wrapped in thermal blankets and carried carefully to the ambulance while Ronan watched from the wagon, his head lifted despite the weakness in his body. Ethan stayed close enough for the old dog to see him. He had learned long ago that Ronan did not need constant touch. He only needed to know his person had not left. At Bozeman Deaconess Hospital, Mason was treated for severe exposure and dehydration. By sunrise, the storm had begun to weaken, and a pale gray light spread across the windows of Haven Ridge. Claire brought Ronan back to the shelter while Ethan waited at the hospital. The old shepherd slept beneath warmed blankets near the lobby fire, one paw resting on the worn harness. 3 hours later, Mason opened his eyes. Ethan sat beside the bed with the notebook on his lap. For a while, neither man spoke. The room smelled of clean linen and coffee from the nurse's station. Snow tapped softly against the glass. Mason looked older than Ethan remembered. The quick smile was gone. His hands trembled slightly beneath the blanket. Yet his eyes were the same steady brown that had once watched over frightened Marines without making them feel weak. You kept him alive, Ethan said. Mason looked toward the window. He kept me alive first. Ethan waited. Mason drew a slow breath. After they moved you, I stayed behind with the recovery team. We searched for Ronan for 2 days. On the third morning, I found him near an abandoned irrigation ditch, dehydrated and limping, but still working the wind for your scent. He would not leave the area until I showed him your glove. Ethan lowered his gaze. Why did nobody tell me? We tried. Your transfer records changed twice. Then you were moved stateside under a different medical unit. By the time I reached the right office, Ronan had already been reassigned on paper. Mason gave a tired laugh without humor. A clerk entered the wrong identification number. 1 digit. That was all it took. Ethan looked at the notebook. And the chip. Mason's face tightened. A clinic removed it years later. It had migrated and caused swelling. I kept every record, but the clinic closed. The files disappeared. You could have sent him to a military facility. I did. Mason looked at him then. 3 times. Each time, they found no active handler attached to his number. He was listed as retired, then unclaimed. I signed temporary custody papers and kept looking for you. Ethan opened the notebook. Pages of addresses and names passed beneath his thumb. Veterans hospitals in Virginia, North Carolina, Texas, Colorado, and Montana. Old unit contacts. Returned letters. Dead phone numbers. For 8 years. For as long as he kept waiting. Mason closed his eyes briefly. At every motel, every shelter, every place we stopped, he watched the door. If a truck sounded like yours, he stood up. If a man whistled 3 notes, he pulled toward the sound. I learned your signal because he taught it to me. Ethan felt something shift inside his chest, part grief and part gratitude. Why were you living in the van? Mason looked away. After I left the service, I could not stay anywhere long. Crowded rooms made me restless. Work never lasted. The van was quiet, and Ronan did not ask questions. His fingers curled around the blanket. I spent what I had on fuel, food, and record searches. Then my heart medication ran low. I thought I could reach Haven Ridge before the storm got worse. Ethan stared at him. You knew I was there? Not until last week. A volunteer at a church in Helena recognized your name from a veteran's newsletter. She gave me the address. Mason swallowed. I was 6 blocks away when the van stopped. The cold came fast. I could not feel my hands. Ronan kept pacing between me and the door. You sent him out. No, Mason's eyes filled with quiet pride. He chose. Ethan remembered the old dog pulling toward the shelter entrance, refusing rest, refusing safety. He found me. He always knew he would. Mason turned his face toward Ethan. I am sorry it took so long. Ethan closed the notebook. The answer rose from somewhere deeper than blame. You brought him home. Mason shook his head. Ronan brought us both. When Ethan returned to Haven Ridge that afternoon, Ronan was awake beside the fire. The moment Ethan entered, the shepherd's tail struck the blanket. Once. Twice. Then Ronan looked past him toward the door. Ethan understood. An hour later, Mason arrived in a wheelchair, wrapped in a Navy hospital blanket. Ronan tried to stand, but Claire held him gently until Mason came close. The 2 men knelt on opposite sides of the old dog. Ronan placed one paw on Ethan's boot and rested his head against Mason's knee. For the first time in 8 years, no one was searching. No one was waiting. All 3 were in the same room, held together by a promise that had survived every wrong address, every winter road, and every silence that should have ended it. By evening, the storm had passed beyond Bozeman, leaving the town beneath a silence so complete that even the snow seemed to be listening. Haven Ridge glowed against the dark, its windows warm and gold, its chimney releasing a thin ribbon of smoke into the clear Montana sky. Inside, dinner had been served, dishes had been washed, and the veterans had returned to their rooms. No one wanted to go far. Ronan lay beside the fireplace on a thick quilt, with Ethan seated on one side and Mason resting in a chair on the other. The old shepherd had spent the afternoon watching both men as though afraid one of them might disappear when he closed his eyes. Each time Ethan crossed the room, Ronan followed him with his gaze. Each time Mason shifted in the chair, one ear lifted. He was still keeping count. Claire checked his temperature shortly after 7 o'clock. It had risen, but his heartbeat had become uneven. She listened longer than before, moving the stethoscope across his chest while Ethan watched her face. He has used almost everything he had, she said quietly. The cold was only part of it. His age, the distance he traveled, the strain of staying awake beside Mason. His body is exhausted. Ethan rested his hand near Ronan's shoulder. What do we do? Keep him warm. Keep him calm. Let the fluids work. Claire met his eyes. And stay close. That last instruction required no explanation. Mason lowered himself carefully from the chair and sat on the rug. His hospital blanket slipped around his shoulders, but he did not pull it back into place. He always hated when people worried over him, he said. Ethan almost smiled. He liked attention. He only wanted everyone to pretend it was part of the job. Mason touched the edge of the harness lying beside Ronan's paws. He carried this through 3 repairs, 2 floods, and more motel rooms than I can count. I tried to replace it once. How did that go? He hid the new one under the van. Ethan looked down at Ronan. That sounds like him. The dog's tail moved faintly against the quilt. For a few minutes, the room felt lighter. Walter brought coffee and left it untouched on the table. Samuel added a log to the fire, then dimmed the overhead lights. One by one, the men of Haven Ridge passed through the lobby without speaking. Some touched Ethan's shoulder. Some nodded toward Mason. One elderly veteran removed a small wooden cross from his pocket and placed it on the mantel before walking away. No one prayed aloud. The kindness was quieter than that. Near 9 o'clock, Ronan's breathing changed. The spaces between each breath grew longer. Claire knelt immediately and placed her hand against his chest. Ethan leaned closer. Ronan. The shepherd's eyes opened halfway. They found Ethan first, then Mason. His paw shifted across the quilt until it touched Ethan's boot. Mason placed 2 fingers against the silver fur near his muzzle. We are both here, old man. Ronan released a breath. Another did not follow. Claire listened to his chest, her expression focused and still. Come on, Mason whispered. Ethan felt the old command rise inside him. Fight. Stay. Do not quit. Those words belonged to training fields and distant roads, to a younger dog who had answered every order without hesitation. Ethan could not ask for one more mission. He lowered himself onto the floor until his face was level with Ronan's. He placed one arm gently around the shepherd's shoulders and rested his forehead against the dog's head. Beneath his palm, the heartbeat weakened, fluttered, then became too faint to find. The fire cracked softly behind them. Snow slid from the roof with a distant hush. Claire kept her fingers against Ronan's chest, but she did not speak. Ethan closed his eyes. For 8 years, he had imagined what he would say if given one final minute. Now every prepared word felt too large. You found me, he whispered. His voice trembled, but he did not look away. I am here now. Mason bowed his head. Ethan stayed beside Ronan without asking him to rise, remember, or remain. He simply held him so that no part of the old promise would be broken again. 1 second passed, then another. The room became perfectly still. A shallow movement touched Ethan's wrist. He lifted his head. Ronan's chest rose. Barely, then fell. A few seconds later, it rose again. Claire leaned closer, listening. Her shoulders slowly lowered. His heart is there, she said. Weak, but steady. Mason covered his face with one hand. Ethan did not move. Ronan opened his eyes and looked at him through the warm half-light. There was no fear in them now. Only weariness. Only trust. Ethan slid his hand beneath the dog's jaw, and Ronan settled into the familiar hold. Outside, the clouds parted above the mountains, revealing a narrow field of stars. Inside Haven Ridge, 2 men remained on the floor beside the dog who had carried them through 8 lost years. No one called it a miracle. They were too close to it for that. They only listened as Ronan took one quiet breath, and then another. Spring came quietly to Bozeman. Snow retreated from the sidewalks in gray ribbons. Cottonwood buds opened along the creek, and the mountains traded their hard white silence for the softer blue of distance. 3 months had passed since the night Ronan found Haven Ridge. He survived, though survival looked different now. He moved slowly. His joints stiffened in the mornings, and he needed help climbing the 2 shallow steps beside the porch. The silver around his muzzle had spread toward his eyes. Yet every dawn, before the coffee finished brewing, Ronan made the same careful round through the shelter. He checked the kitchen, the hallway, the reading room, the front door. Only after he had counted every person did he settle beside Ethan's desk. No one had assigned him the duty. Some promises did not require orders. Ethan no longer worked only the night shift. After years of hiding in the quiet hours, he had accepted the position of Resident Services Coordinator. He still repaired heaters and remembered how everyone took their coffee, but now he also attended meetings, spoke with county officials, and built something Haven Ridge had never offered before. The program was called Second Watch. Local rescue dogs were paired with veterans who needed routine, companionship, or simply a reason to step outside in the morning. The dogs were not treated as cures. The veterans were not treated as broken. They learned each other slowly. A walk around the block. A bowl filled at the same hour. A hand resting on warm fur during a difficult night. Small acts. Repeated faithfully. Mason moved into a room near the rear garden after leaving the hospital. At first, he kept his belongings packed in 2 canvas bags, ready to disappear before anyone could ask him to stay. Ethan never asked. He only left a key on Mason's nightstand and said, "The door works both ways." The bags remained packed for 11 days. On the 12th, Mason placed his shirts in the dresser. By April, he was helping Claire organize medical records for Second Watch. His hands still trembled on some mornings, but they steadied whenever he fastened a collar or measured medicine. He spoke little about the years in the van. He did not need to. The men at Haven Ridge understood that returning was not a single moment. It was a practice. Ronan divided his time between Ethan and Mason without preference. He slept beside Ethan's desk in the afternoon and rested near Mason's chair after dinner. If either man left the building, Ronan waited where he could see the door. The old harness no longer fit comfortably over his chest, so Ethan cleaned it, repaired the frayed edge, and hung it on a wooden peg above the entrance. The red stitching remained visible in one corner. Beneath it, the name Walker faced everyone who came inside. One rainy evening in late April, a county outreach van stopped at the curb. A young veteran stepped out carrying a green duffel bag. His name was Caleb Brooks. He was 26, thin beneath an oversized jacket, with pale skin, close-cut blonde hair, and the guarded eyes of someone expecting every welcome to be withdrawn. The driver placed the duffel on the porch, spoke to him for a moment, then left. Caleb remained outside. Through the lobby window, Ethan watched him stare at the shelter door. Rain darkened his shoulders. His hand reached toward the handle twice, then fell. Ethan recognized the stillness. It was not indecision. It was shame wearing the uniform of caution. Walter looked up from a puzzle near the fireplace. "You going to get him?" Ethan shook his head. "Not yet." The door opened before anyone touched it. Ronan had pushed it with his muzzle. The shepherd stepped onto the porch, slow and stiff, his paws making soft sounds against the wet wood. Caleb noticed him and moved back. Ronan did not approach directly. He lowered himself several feet away and looked toward the street. Rain gathered along his back. Caleb glanced through the glass at the people inside, then at the old dog beside him. "You should go in," he murmured. Ronan stayed. Minutes passed. No one from Haven Ridge came outside. No one called Caleb's name. No one told him to be brave. Ronan simply remained near the door, asking nothing. At last, Caleb sat on the porch step. His duffel rested between his boots. "I do not know if I belong here," he said. Ronan shifted closer until his shoulder touched the young man's knee. Caleb's hand hovered above the silver fur, uncertain, then settled gently between the dog's ears. Ronan leaned into it. The touch was enough. Caleb looked through the open doorway. Ethan stood near the desk, but did not wave him forward. He only moved a mug beneath the coffee maker and waited. Caleb picked up his duffel. Ronan rose beside him, turned, and walked into the shelter at the young man's pace. As they crossed the threshold, the harness above the door moved slightly in the spring breeze. Mason watched from the hallway. Ethan met his eyes. Neither man spoke. The name on that harness had once belonged to a Marine who believed he had failed his partner. Now it belonged to a doorway that no one had to enter alone. Ronan settled beside Caleb's chair while rain softened against the windows. Ethan placed the warm mug on the table. Mason brought a dry towel. Around them, Haven Ridge continued its ordinary evening, quiet and imperfect and alive. Ronan closed his eyes, one paw resting against Caleb's boot. His final duty was not to search for what had been lost. It was to remain beside those who had not yet realized they were found.